welcome to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles, and I am your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. Got an incredible program lined up for you today. Dr. Professor Belinda Roman of St. Mary's University, the economics department specifically, is going to be joining our South Texas correspondent Sandra Sanchez and I to discuss the economics of cross-border trade when it comes to shoppers here, people coming from just over the other side of the border over to our side of the border. So we're going to take a look at some of the data involved there. Really looking forward to that conversation. But first, as always, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the things making headlines across the border, starting with some concerning news here on the screwworm, which South Texas correspondent Sandra Sanchez has been just on top of since we first heard about this. But we're learning that Mexico has activated emergency protocols and controls, rather, after detecting a new case of New World screwworm in cattle in Nuevo Leon. For those of you that don't know, that is right next to the U.S. border. Now, the New World screwworm is a flesh-eating parasite that infests warm-blooded animals, including humans, and it is now just 70 miles south of the Texas-Mexico border. It poses a significant threat to the state's cattle industry. Now, the animal came from Veracruz, where the last case was reported back in July. You may remember when we told you about that. That prompted Washington, D.C. to suspend imports of live Mexican cattle. Mexico has reported over 500 active cases in southern states. Now, the import ban could cost Mexico's ranching industry up to $400 million if it stays in place. The U.S. Department of Agriculture is investing hundreds of millions of dollars into a new sterile fly production facility in South Texas, actually in the city of Edinburgh, which is about 30 or so miles from here in Harlingen, Texas. Now, the sterile fly technique eradicated the pest from the country back in the 1960s, but the Texas Agricultural Commissioner, Sid Miller, says he believes more can be done to kill the pest faster, including deploying a certain fly developed by the Texas Agriculture Commission.
Once the bait is deployed, we can eradicate 90% of them in 60 days. Follow that up with the sterile flies, and they're eradicated completely 100% in 90 days. Once the bait is deployed.
Now, Miller said the agency's bait is currently being tested in Panama, which is a hot zone for screwworms. U.S. Agricultural Secretary Brooke Rollins said imports on Mexican cattle, bison, and horses will remain suspended. Also happening, the White House is standing behind quote-unquote border czar Tom Homan following reports that he accepted $50,000 in bribes from undercover agents. The agents were posing as business people during an undercover FBI operation last year. That led to a bribery investigation that was shut down by the Trump administration's Justice Department. A White House spokeswoman categorized Homan's encounter with the undercover agents as an effort by the Biden administration to, quote, entrap one of the president's top allies and supporters, end quote. MSNBC first reported over the weekend that Homan had accepted the cash during a 2024 meeting with undercover agents, posing as business people seeking government contracts that Homan suggested he could help them get in a second Trump term. Time now to bring in our South Texas correspondent, Sandra Sanchez, and our guest for today's episode. Sandra, I'll let you introduce her.
Dr. Belinda Roman is Associate Professor of Economics at St. Mary's University in San Antonio. Welcome, Dr. Roman.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Okay, so Wednesday, you came to McAllen. I was there at the Performing Arts Center. There was this morning of diplomacy, representatives from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, and you gave a presentation that was fascinating in regards to a study that the City of McAllen commissioned you to do to, I think, track the number of shoppers from across the border, Reynosa, Mexico, into McAllen. Is that correct? Get us up to speed and tell us what those results were.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. The purpose of the project was to try to understand the role that shoppers from Reynosa play in McAllen, because there have been a number of studies trying to gauge and put a dollar value on how many shoppers and what the significance of those shoppers are in the local economy. But, we've always been guessing. We've always been using primarily U.S. data. So this time around, I tried a more innovative technique to help them do that. And what we did was we tracked the cell phones as they crossed the border from Reynosa into McAllen, and then followed them as they went shopping in all the different parts of the city. this gave us a much better idea as to what's really happening with this cross-border shopping phenomenon that we've all basically lived through if we've been living on the border.
Now, to track someone with a cell phone, I think you said that they had to have had a resting cell phone for so many hours in Reynosa. I mean, how do you know that that's where the cell phone originated? The person is really a Reynosa. And how did you describe the methodology a little bit for us?
Sure. So the idea was to look to see for the 48 hours before the cell phone crosses into the border where it was resting. So because all of the cell phones have GPS attached to them, we can tell where they are. So we narrowed it down to the neighborhoods in Reynosa, and they had to be there for 48 hours. So our assumption was that they didn't just arrive into the city overnight and then cross. What they did was they actually were resting there. So we took that to mean that that was probably a more permanent position for them. And we matched that with the census data from the Mexican government so that we could get a sense of what's going on in the neighborhood in terms of median income, size of family, connectivity, like how many of them have internet, how many of cell phones are in each neighborhood and each home. And this is all the most recent data from the Mexican government and their census, rather than relying on the U.S. data to try to figure it out.
That's amazing how much information you can get from a cell phone. Now, I understand, to kind of boil it down, you came up with 33 shopping days. The times, well, I'll let you describe them. What days did you track and what did you find out?
Right. So the plan was to kind of narrow it down to key shopping retail sales events in the McAllen area. And because the research was driven by the Economic Development Department, they wanted to know in these key moments in the year, what is the role that the Mexican shopper plays in this area? So we focused on the Christmas, New Year's period, which was about 2 weeks, all the way up to Dia de los Reyes. Then we switched over to Semana Santa for the week.
That's Easter week for those watching.
Easter week, I'm sorry, yes, Easter week. And then we switched over to Black Friday, that whole week right after Thanksgiving in the United States. Because the border is the way it is, people are shopping and sharing these holidays. So we wanted to capture those moments, and it ended up being about 33 days worth of information from start to finish.
And you came up with $49.2 million spent by Reynosa residents in McAllen. That is a phenomenal number, right?
It is. It is. And I actually think that might be a little bit on the low end, because the most elusive part of this research is figuring out exactly how much they're spending when they walk into the store. And for that, we'd have to follow everybody around all the time. So we have to use estimates. And the last estimate was done by a business professor, I think, in Monterrey. He did it several years ago, and he came up with something like $113 per shopper. And I actually think that's kind of low, but I used it anyway because it was the most reliable number that we had, the most recent.
And officials there at the breakfast said that equated to almost $80 million in total impact for McAllen, because there's a multiplier effect, right?
Yes, exactly. And the multiplier that I used was only the initial sales.
Okay.
There's this whole other layer of additional workers, additional salaries, additional wages, just this whole very flowering sort of picture that we didn't get into last week, and which is part of the continuing research.
And so I thought it was really fascinating. Some of the places that people visited, I think one of the number one places, and it wasn't just necessarily shopping, they went to American ATMs. Is that correct?
Correct. I found that the most revealing part of the research was there was a lot of the shoppers went to an American ATM, whether it was at an HEB or some other location like that, which indicates that they're pulling out U.S. dollars at the ATM machines. And so that was, subject of conversation, because that has to mean that maybe the exchange rate isn't as significant a player as we originally thought, because the image is that they go to the Casa de Cambio, the exchange houses, change the money, then go shopping. But it looks like now they're going to the ATM and pulling the money out there. It's a better exchange rate, easier to work with. And so I think there's still a very large cash economy along the border.
That's really interesting. I also noticed a lot of people visited those places where you can refill water jugs, watermill type facilities, right? And it wasn't just necessarily retail shop. There were doctors' visits as well. Yes. Tell us the wide swath of places that you tracked.
Yes, I mean, it's just like watching us live our lives on this side of the border. Going to the doctor, going to the dentist, getting your eyes checked, going shopping, going to the various name brands in the shopping centers, going to HEB, Western Union, insurance, law, accounting, every single walk of life, every type of industry was represented in the data set.
I wanted to ask, because you were talking about the ATM numbers, going back to that, does the age, is there any way to track age? Is it younger folks maybe hitting those ATMs instead of the Casa de Cambios, like some of the previous generations typically used?
Well, what I have right now is very sort of general level information from both the U.S. and the Mexican side. And they tend to be 24 to 34-year-olds using ATMs, and then 34 to 50s using ATMs. Maybe 50, 40% respectively using it. So there is a little bit of that going on. So there's some generational. And I think they're researching it now. On the Mexican side, actually, I think, because there's a big push to have more ATM activity and information.
All right. Well, stay with us, Professor Roman. We're going to take a very quick break, and you stick with us at home, too. Border Report Live is back in 1 minute. And welcome back to Border Report Live. My name is Rudy. I'm your host here in Harlingen, Texas. Joining us now, South Texas correspondent Sandra Sanchez, and our guest today, Professor Belinda Roman of St. Mary's University.
Dr. Roman, we were talking about how you've been studying the shoppers in Reynosa, and one thing you were able to conclude, the average income of the shopper there, and it was a surprising number. Tell us what you found out.
Yes, I thought that was very interesting in the results. The average income of the shoppers, around the periods that we're looking at, was somewhere around $45,000, $46,000.
U.S. dollars.
The median income for U.S. dollars, because I converted everything to U.S. dollars for the audience. So the shoppers coming over are a middle class shopper that I think is, helping McAllen and looking for opportunities. And I think that's a very important story to be told.
And again, you tracked these cell phones resting for 48 hours. You tracked like 800 of them. I know that you had one map that had a million little dots, red dots everywhere. I think we also have some slides that show some of the totals here. Here we go. This shows a little bit. Explain to us what we're looking at here, ma'am.
Right. So these are the months within which those dates fall. So it was December, January, March, and then the following year. What I did was I went through and I looked at all of those dates. And then I decided that for context, we needed to see how big the numbers actually are. So the total number of rows of data corresponds to the number of times there was a site visited in McAllen. So, they could have gone a number of different times to different places, but during the month, the cell phone went. So this is the number of times we see it.
177 million times, visits. Wow. Okay.
Yes.
And
it was enormous.
I know that there was something mentioned that 45% of what happens economically in McAllen is linked to those people coming from Reynosa. Is that a conclusion that you all reached?
Yeah, it's somewhere closer to, they've always thought it's about a third of what goes on in the retail sector is attributable to Reynosa and people coming over. So I think that's very accurate. It may even be bigger because I didn't track the commercial. So I didn't track the trucks or anything like that. This is just shopping and people doing that type of daily activity.
Now, let's take a bigger look because we've been looking at one city, and specifically, are you planning to study other cities, or are you doing that already? Are you doing a bigger border economic survey?
Well, this is, data takes a lot of capacity and it takes a lot of funding. So I think we're going to try to incrementally build on this and maybe look at the movement between Monterrey, Reynosa, and then McAllen, because that seems to be a regularly transited route. And then I did get a question about El Paso Juarez. And because the size is so enormous, I got to figure out how we might be able to do that and manage that level of data.
Now, the time frame, the last study was done, so Semana Santa last March, and you had Black Friday. So none of this, though, was studied since the new Trump administration took office, correct? So there were no threats to the change in the tariffs, and we saw a little bit of hesitation from shoppers, uncertain, right? So this was prior to that.
Correct. This was 2024. So the next task, besides expanding away from the border, would be also to add another year, so that we can understand what happens when we see these types of policies changing. Because it may be that they come less frequently, but they may also be spending more when they come, right? So you're not going as often and spending smaller amounts. You're spending bigger amounts, but in fewer opportunities, just in case the policies change.
And I think the fact that we're looking at middle class, $45,000 annual U.S. salary, the equivalent of Reynosa. I asked the city manager, Isaac Towell, will that change the way the city targets people coming over? Will you build more facilities, earmarked towards them? And he said they're going to take this data and run with it. So there could be more malls and there could be more places that these people specifically, it's shown, want to visit, want to frequent, and they want to attract those people.
Absolutely. Let's not forget that Reynosa is about 800,000 in population. So it dwarfs McAllen significantly. So together, it's almost 1 million people in that region alone. So there's room for expansion, room for growth.
Right.
And so this just validates that there is a middle class on both sides that we are not catering to, or we could do more with. And I think that's an important message.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Roman. This was really fascinating. Rudy, any other questions that you might have?
Well, I just wanted to, mention we have a Simon Mall property here, very close to the border, and it's one of hundreds across the country. And this one continuously is, ranking at the top when it comes to sales. How much of that do you think is credited to those shoppers coming from over the border?
I think a lot, because when you actually get into the data, I can see all the brands that are being that they're going to and shopping at, and how long they stay. So that definitely is, they're helping because McAllen's only 140,000, so it's not only, I don't want to, but it's not as big population wise, but so it's got, that has to be coming from somewhere else, doesn't it? So I think Reynosa might be the secret sauce down there. And we need to, continue to elaborate on that.
All right. Well, thank you again for joining us today, Dr. Roman. Dr. Belinda Roman, Professor of Economics at St. Mary's University. Stay with us. Border Report Live is back in 1 minute. And welcome back to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mideles, and I am your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. Now, I want to bring in our South Texas correspondent, Sandra Sanchez, one more time, because, Sandra, we went to a summit yesterday, a law enforcement community summit that was held at South Padre Island. One of the interesting things that I heard is that human trafficking specifically, is a bigger problem than we actually think down here on the border. And let me just set this up real quick. I mean, so often we think of the trafficking, both the drugs and the human, type of trafficking, that is just passing through here, right? We don't really take into account perhaps the trafficking problem that we have here on the border itself. Can you kind of explain what they talked about at that summit yesterday?
Yeah, and it was held at South Padre Island, and I did interview the police chief there, Claudine O'Connell, and she clarified that they actually don't have trafficking cases on this very small populated barrier island. It's a tourist resort. That's where they held the summit. But here in the Rio Grande Valley, just over the causeway in the other cities, it is a big problem. In fact, Texas is number 2 for the most hotline reports for sex trafficking or labor trafficking in the whole country.
Wow.
There was a gentleman who was the keynote speaker, Scaramucci, who came down from, Detective Scaramucci came down from Waco. We spoke afterwards as well. He said, well, Texas is also the number 2 state for population, so you have to weigh that when you factor it. But some of the startling statistics, at any given time, 313,000 people could either be in Texas sex trafficked or human trafficked, and sometimes both together, often involves children. This was the Conference on Crimes Against Women Summit Beyond the Bounds. It's kind of an extension on the annual Conference on Crime Summit that happens in the Dallas area. This drew about 300 people, a lot of law enforcement, prosecutors, victims advocates, counselors, and they learned tips on how to notice the signs of someone being trafficked. It's not what you think. In fact, Detective Scaramucci put up a slide showing people with ropes and duct tape on their, and he says, I have never come across a case like that. And he's worked on over 600 cases. Usually they're people that are just right out in the community that you just don't even realize what's going on. He encouraged people to network, to talk with one another, and for the different groups to work together to try to prosecute these cases and get these crimes stopped. He said one of the biggest problems is these different groups, prosecutors and detectives, police, they all work in separate silos, and they don't necessarily meld together. In order to get this to stop, he says that they have to share information and really work together. So, a lot of sensitive information, but a hard topic to come up with, but an important topic to get these crimes stopped.
Well, what's interesting about that is it's not just on law enforcement and their different capacities to recognize the signs of human trafficking either. Someone has to report the actual human trafficking, and that is so really incumbent on us as, we're walking into these places. I mean, you can walk into any nail salon here in the Rio Grande Valley or in the entire state of Texas, and you see, recognize the signs of trafficking signs, those mandatory postings that they have to post along with their licenses and stuff. But, it's just very interesting that it's kind of incumbent on all of us to do our part to recognize the signs of human trafficking and make sure it's reported.
And the number one place for trafficking, illicit massage places. And we have reported here and in borderreport.com a number of DHS arrests at foot massage parlors, pedicure places.
Houston was the last one we reported on. Houston area. Yeah.
There's been a trend that we've been seeing, and that follows the data that he released.
All right. Well, thank you again so much for your help today on this program, Sandra Sanchez, our South Texas correspondent. Have a few more headlines to tell you about on this Tuesday afternoon, starting with the Department of Homeland Security said it would not follow California's new law banning its agents from covering their faces during enforcement operations. You may remember we told you about this in yesterday's episode of Border Report Live. Well, according to DHS spokesperson, they said, quote, "To be clear, we will not comply with California Governor Gavin Newsom's unconstitutional mask ban," end quote. They did that on the social media platform known as X. Now, DHS suggested the masks provide protection for the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents who have seen a sharp rise in attacks in recent months. Newsom, who is a possible 2028 presidential contender, signed a first-of-its-kind bill on Saturday banning ICE agents from wearing masks while operating in the state. He said ICE agents would no longer be, quote, hidden from accountability, arguing that masks prevent transparency for citizens and hinder oversight. And also happening, NPR is reporting that nearly 20 immigration judges received emails this month informing them that they are being let go. That adds to the over 80 judges that have already been cut by President Trump so far this year. At least 14 immigration judges learned Friday that they would be put on leave and that their employment would terminate as soon as Wednesday in some cases. The details were confirmed by the union that represents immigration court judges. Courts in Florida, New York, Maryland, California, and Washington State are among those infected. And speaking of California Governor Gavin Newsom, I want to tell you to check out our partners at Political Power Ranker. It is a weekly show tracking the movers, shakers, and rule makers in American politics. Nextstar's Director of Political Content, Chris Berg, and Director of Emerson College Polling, Spencer Kimball, break down who's up and who's down in the world of politics based on data. And I got to participate, helping out with this program for the last episode. And like I told you, Governor Gavin Newsom, among others, they were following the governor's race in California and looking at the popularity of Gavin Newsom overall. So if you're interested in checking that out, you can find more on Political Power Ranker at abc27.com or your local Nexstar station's website. That is going to do it for us today. We want to again thank Dr. Belinda Roman, economics professor at St. Mary's University, for joining us. Until tomorrow, have a great day.